Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this week we're going to talk about a gentleman named Frederick Taylor, and also we're going to talk about Henry Ford. Now, all of these things are connected. Last week we talked about retailing, we talked about consumerism, and in order to have retailing and consumerism, you have to have the goods, the stuff to sell. So that meant in the early 1900s there was this big ramp up of manufacturing in the U.S., whether it was automobiles or appliances or clothing or shoes. All of these items at that time were made in this country. So factories came online to supply the needs of consumers. And with that in mind, much earlier in the semester, we talked about the American system of manufacturing, this idea of interchangeable parts. And what happens is, at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, around that period of time, this notion of scientific manufacturing or scientific management comes online. This idea of efficiency studies, and it's sort of the one right way to do things, especially when it comes to factories. So Frederick Taylor, many of you probably know who he is. If you're a Kobe student, you certainly know who he is. But Frederick Taylor was really the father of scientific management and scientific manufacturing. So you're going to read a little bit about him. There's this notion out there amongst historians of business, Taylorism. And so when people talk about Taylorism, they talk about the rise of efficient manufacturing methods. This wasn't always popular with everyone. It's seen by some people that Frederick Taylor and his techniques led to sort of the de-skilling of people, or the decline of craftsmanship, as speed and accuracy overcame or took over where craftsmanship was in place before. But certainly because of our consumer habits, whether it was then or even today, we want things inexpensive and we want things of consistent quality. And it's through this notion of efficient manufacturing methods, such as Taylorism, that occurs. So that's why Taylor's important, and that's how Taylor relates to not only the consumer movement and mass marketing of goods, but also relates all the way back to the American system of manufacturing, which we read about in the second or third week of the semester. The other reading this week is, of course, about Henry Ford. I think most of you know what his story is. So read about that. I think we know about the assembly line and how Ford really perfected it. We also know that Ford paid his employees well at the time. He paid his employees well enough where they could actually afford the cars that they make, so that was pretty brilliant. But the other thing I want you to think about when you read about Ford is his personality, because we're going to go on next week or the week after to read about a gentleman named David Sarnoff, who headed RCA, Radio Corporation of America, and he was similar to a lot of ways to Henry Ford. And then also we're going to read about Steve Jobs in a few weeks, and he was similar also. So I want you to think about these personality types and similarities of someone who is brilliant but stubborn at the same time. And bottom line is very successful. Both Ford and much later Steve Jobs have this idea of the way things should be done, and that's the way they do things, and sometimes the market passes them by and sometimes it doesn't. Certainly in the case with Ford, I mean, he had the Model T. It was certainly the car that he thought was good enough for everybody, but the market started to change. People wanted different things. They wanted maybe fancier things. And this goes back to Michael Flamm's lecture of last week about individualism, how people want to be different, they want to show off, and that's part of the consumerist society that we live in. And Ford didn't really get that. So keep those things in mind as you do the readings, and we'll be back again next week to talk about RCA. Thanks. Have a great day.